If only there could be time for a nap for Brian Grete. After all, he's earned it. He just can't get one yet. Hi, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast. I'm Dave Price. Brian is the editor of Pro Farmer, and we caught up with him right after he had just spent a long, grueling week on the road. Ever since 1993, Pro Farmer's Midwest Crop Tour has led a team, along with a lot of volunteers, who randomly inspect fields across the region. It's how they make their corn and bean predictions based on a variety of factors, and we'll get to those in a bit. But first, how did Brian get to the place where he is now? Let's ask. Let's start this way. How'd you get to where you are?
Long time ago, I grew up on a farm in southeast Iowa, and I went to a high school that was largely city kids, and I wasn't really interested in agriculture because of that. I just thought, they had a lot more advantages, or so to speak, and so I wasn't interested in agriculture. But after going through school, getting a communications degree, getting hired on at Pro Farmer, I've come full circle. And while I'm not farming, I'm very much involved in agriculture. And so everything came full circle for me.
All right, so before we started recording, I made this lame joke that is clearly wrong. After you just had a week like you did, first of all, we're lucky to get you the following week, but I figured you'd be on a beach chilling out. But of course, this is the week to catch up and talk about what this crop tour was like. Will you let us inside there? Like, how do you pull this thing off every year?
Yeah, so we do it with a lot of scouts, actually. We have about 100 scouts that volunteer their time and efforts to get us the ability to get across 7 states in 4 days time frame. So we break it up in the eastern leg. That's the one that I direct, and we start in Western Ohio and go across that into Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and then into Southeast Minnesota. The Western leg, that starts in Southeast South Dakota and goes down through Nebraska, up through Western Iowa, and then the rest of Southern Minnesota. And so, like I said, we cover those 7 states in a 4-day period. So it's a lot of moving parts. It's a lot of hard work by our scouts. And we pull roughly about 1,700 corn and soybean samples each during that 4-day period. And so it is really a working tour, and we're fully dedicated and appreciative of our scouts who, like I said, donate their time and efforts to get it all done.
So how do you select where they are looking, where they're checking, where they're going?
Yeah, that's a common question that I receive, and we give them a map. And so on the eastern leg, there's 11 different routes that are predetermined, highlighted routes. They are instructed to stop roughly every 12 to 15 miles along that route. So they are random stops. We don't want them to be going back to the same fields year after year and that type of stuff. We want it to be fully random. So we leave it up to the discretion of the driver. I often get asked, do you only pick the best looking fields or the worst looking fields or what may be? And honestly, you'd never know from the road what you're going to get into. It's random. So we don't pick based on what the field looks like. But even if we did, we go past the end rows in the corn, and then we go another 35 paces and we mark out 2 30-foot plots. And a lot of times when you get past the end rows and another 35 paces into the field, it may look a lot different than it did from the road. And so you can't tell. But we're often accused of picking only the best fields or only the worst looking fields.
Not true, though. Not true.
Absolutely not true. And in soybeans, we go into a representative sample in the field. So, if the field is lush and looks like green carpet, that's pretty easy. Pretty much every spot in the field is representative. If there's some drownouts or stuff like that, areas that have disease, then we kind of got to be a little bit more selective in terms of getting a representative sample from that field.
You talked about you have this team of 100 scouts. So how does this work? You're the head coach here. You got everybody together. I mean, how did people find out what they're doing? How does that work?
Yeah, so we gather on Sunday night before crop tour begins, and I give them their instructions. Now, out of those 100 scouts, they're split roughly 50-50 with the eastern leg and the western leg. So I'm in charge of about half of them. But I give them instructions, and out of that portion that I have, there's roughly 50-60% that have come back year after year.
Hmm.
Many times they're veteran scouts, and so they know what they're doing. They don't require as much instruction. We do have some that participate that have never been in a corner soybean field before, because we open it up to anybody that's interested in what wanting to know what the size of the U.S. corn and soybean crop is in the third week of August, and we get foreign scouts that come in, from all walks of life. Most of them are associated in one way, shape, or form, whether it's a grain buyer, international grain buyer, or works for a hedge fund, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, we've had complete rookie scouts, and a lot of our scouts are farmers though, and repeat year after year. They come back, and but my goal at the end of the week is that even the new scouts can then turn around and explain the process to someone else, because really what we're doing is gathering data. The data that we need to go into our spreadsheets is required. Anything on top of that, like plant disease, plant health, those types of things, that's kind of a bonus on top. And the scouting teams have at least one veteran in every single vehicle. Many times there's multiple veterans in those vehicles, and almost assuredly there's at least one farmer in each of those groups.
Now you're talking about it's the bonus, but I would assume that that bonus part there, I mean, that's really what a lot of folks want to know, right?
Absolutely, and that goes in a lot into our analysis of it. So Monday through Friday of crop tour week, we go into the fields, we collect the samples, we record the data, and that goes into a spreadsheet. That's raw data. So that's released on a nightly meeting basis, state by state basis there. And that's raw crop tour data. At the end of the week on Friday, after crop tour's finished, Pro Farmer, we take that data and we analyze it. And we also take into account the areas outside of where we scouted on crop tour, weather, how we think crops will finish, and all those types of things. And we put out the Pro Farmer crop estimates. Those are separate from crop tour data. And that's oftentimes confused because they're hearing one thing Monday through Thursday, and then Pro Farmer comes out with crop estimates on Friday, and the state numbers almost assuredly are different because we know the miss factors, how much we miss each state by with the crop tour data on from data back over 32-year period of time that we've been doing this. We know that we don't go into all areas of every state. Iowa is the only state that we're in all 99 counties in. The other 6 states on crop tour, we don't get into all areas of those states. We know that. We talk to people and farmers and industry folks in those areas where we don't go, and that all goes into the Pro Farmer estimates and is aside from the raw data that we pull Monday through Thursday.
And just to build out on that, so you can kind of push back about anybody who doesn't think this is representative, how, since you are not going into all the counties in those other states, how do you make sure that at the end of the day, you've got a pretty solid analysis on what the big picture is?
Yeah, so like I said, we talk to farmers and industry individuals in those other areas. We know our historical miss in each state, and we also know our historical miss. I'll give Illinois as an example. Number 2 production state for corn,
Mhm.
number 1 in soybeans, and so we we don't go in the southern roughly third of that state. We know in years when Illinois has a really big yield above 200 bushels, we miss it by more than our historical norm. Um, we also know that in years when it has a record yield, which is projected this year, that we miss it by even more. And so we take some of those additional factors into account when we come up with the pro farmer estimates. And typically, using Illinois as an example again, that northern 2/3 of the state historically has carried the corn production for the state. But that southern third in years when it's really big yield and really big production has either held steady or actually pulled up in some of those cases. And so that tends to be why we miss by a bigger factor in those years. And that all comes into the analysis that Pro Farmer puts on it at the end of the week.
I appreciate the love for the southern part of the state because I grew up in Southwest Illinois. So appreciate that you recognize the contributions there.
Absolutely, and they've really picked up. Not the greatest soils down there. I
Sure.
would argue that that area is somewhat more mid south than it is Midwest, but over the past 15 years, the production in that region has really increased quite a bit, and the farmer down there is able to do it with somewhat lesser soils than those that are further to the north.
Was it all the coal mines? Do you have any idea? Did that screw things up?
I don't know. I just know that the terrain and the soil type isn't as good down there, and we rely heavily on a couple of our veteran industry sources that we've had over the years to give us a good indication. Okay, is the southern third of Illinois, is it going to pull down this year? Is it going to
Mhm.
hold steady, or is it going to pull up? And so we have relied heavily on that over the years.
Can you talk a little bit about, you talked about that somewhere around half, maybe more than half of the scouts return. So when you've got, that means about half of them are rookies. How do you counsel them ahead of time about, all right, here's what you're looking for with corn, here's what you're looking for with beans? How do you do that?
Yeah, so we give them the procedure first off. They have to know what they're doing when they go into a field. And then it's just a matter of following the steps. And so I mentioned we go past the end rows, then we go another 35 paces into the cornfield. We lay out two 30-foot plots in adjoining rows, so or adjacent rows, and we count all the ears on those two rows. From one of those two rows, we pull ear 5, 8, and 11. Uh, and that's what we do our measurement off of those 3 years. So it's very systematic. It's the same in every single field. It's really hard to miscount ears when you get into a field. It may seem like that to people that aren't familiar with being inside of a cornfield, but when you get out there, it's really pretty easy. And then straightforward with, okay, I'm going to pull the ears from my row while you count all of the ones in your row. And 5, 8, and 11 is pretty simple. I mean, it's hard to mess up if you can count. So,
That's
um,
some easy math.
yeah, sometimes the hardest part is actually getting out of the field for the people that aren't experienced within it. And in that case, we tell them to use their senses. If you get turned around in there and you're wondering about where you came from, remember, did you come across rows, or were you walking with rows when you walked in? Um, those types of things. Use your ears because you can hear the roadways. Cars only drive on roadways. Use your eyes
Hopefully.
because if you look up, you can see power lines and those types of things. But probably that is the most frightening thing for new scouts is
Hmm.
going into a cornfield and the fear of getting lost. And I always tell them, I said, like, don't panic, because if you panic, your mind does weird things to you. Just use your senses if you get turned around, and you'll find your way back out. And I can tell you, in 32 years, we've never permanently lost any single scout in a cornfield. There have been times when they've got turned around a little bit, and it took us a little bit of effort to help them find their way out. But we've never permanently lost anyone.
But I would assume that, and you mentioned 32-year history here, but that is probably something you got to warn these folks about ahead of time. You talk about, the folks like me didn't grow up on a farm. You get in there, we've all seen the movies of people getting turned around in a corn maze or something, and this is more intense than that. But the freak out factor could be real if that's not your background.
Absolutely. And your mind, I'm a firm believer that your mind is very powerful and it can do kind of wild things to you when you're out in the cornfield, especially with modern genetics. The corn is tall.
Hmm.
Many of the times the corn is significantly taller than it used to be when I was growing up, and those types. But just for the most part, they do a good job, and we go in and typically in teams of two, so it takes two people to kind of get lost most of the time in the cornfield
Uh,
to have any kind of issue there.
That's where the knee high by the 4th of July. That's long since passed, but that's far less intimidating when it's knee high when you're walking through. A little premature though now.
Absolutely. When you can see over the top of it, I'm not very tall. In 2012, I was above the corn because of the drought that
Mm,
year. That
sure.
was, hard. You wouldn't have got lost in any cornfield that year. A year like this, where it's been good growing conditions for pretty much the entire season, 10+ feet tall in some of those cases to the top of the tassels.
You already teased, I'll save this, but you already teased about how this is, looks like could be a really good year. But talk about the challenges that your team's noticed out there, maybe when it comes to disease or anything else.
Yeah, so a relatively clean crop this year. If anything, maybe a little bit more water hemp than normal in the eastern side, a little bit more volunteer corn than normal. It's probably cutting back on some of the fertilizer applications to cut that back. But I think it's more cosmetic than anything. I don't think when it's all said and done, it'll have much of an impact at all on the yield. Corn disease, tar spot, it's out there in portions of the eastern corn belt and the western corn belt as well. But that seems to be the new hot topic within the farm community is the tar spot and how much impact it'll have on yield. I can tell you that like the earlier it hits, the more damaging it's going to be to the plants and therefore to yield. The later it comes across in the growing season, the less impact it'll have on yield. And that's pretty much from every agronomist we've talked to has the same opinion on that.
And definitely in parts of these areas you're talking about, those last 3, almost 4 years, and I'm talking to you from Iowa, where we've dealt with drought for quite a while. Finally, it seems like we're getting a little relief, although it's been dry lately again. But I would assume you really see pockets of that. Are we getting to the other side of the worst of the drought?
Yeah. So every drought in the history of the world has been broken with a flood and excessive moisture. And we saw some of that in the northwestern corn belt this year,
Hmm.
South Dakota, southeast South Dakota, um, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, northern, northwestern Iowa, north central Iowa, those areas. And the western side did get into drown out spots in those areas. Now, we do our same procedure. If we stop at a field and it has drownouts and you do your paces out, and if you happen to end in a drowned out spot, that's a zero. If there's nothing there to measure. If there's partial to measure, then we measure partial, and that comes back obviously at a reduced yield. But we often get that question about what do you do in those
Hmm.
situations. We measure it just like we would otherwise. So you do your paces out into the field, and if you end up in a drown out spot, you record it as such.
But by and large, overall, that we were seeing less drought, though. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. We had really good rainfall through the growing season in most of these areas, excessive, like I mentioned, in those particular areas in the northwestern Corn Belt. But uh, as a whole, this has been a very good growing season, and the corn and soybean crops reflect that.
All right. So let's get to the headliner of this, and that I mean, you're seeing some big numbers, both corn and beans.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we record ear counts and then put a yield factor on it within our spreadsheet Monday through Thursday with the crop tour data, and we had some records. Iowa was a record yield for the crop tour data samples. Illinois was a record so your number one and two production states both came in at records for crop tour data, and so that's kind of the leader right there. Um, on the soybean side of things, we count pods in a 3 foot by 3 foot area. So we lay out a 3 foot plot and we count the number of plants there. We randomly pull three of those plants and we average up the number of pods on that. We multiply it by 36 and then divide it by the row spacing. And basically what that does is it makes every field the same. So you're comparing apples to apples. So 7.5-inch row spacing is the same as 36-inch row spacing with that formula. And we had a huge number of soybean pods. And the reason we don't do a yield calculation on crop tours because every state historically has a different number of pods that it takes to make a bushel. And so we would have to redo the formula every time we crossed a state line. Well, I mentioned we're in 7 states in 4 days, and every vehicle goes across the line at a different time. And so it would be really, really hard to make all that logistically work. And so we just count the pods, and then Pro Farmer puts a yield on it at the end. But just really strong potential this year. The Pro Farmer yield estimate for corn is 181.1 bushels per acre. And for soybeans, it's 54.9 bushels per acre. So it would be a record for both and reflective of the good growing conditions that we've had this year.
Can you look back over your time there and, you're measuring this in August to kind of give you a forecast of what you're expecting. How often does that turn out to be, relatively speaking, about the ballpark of where it is, or where weather comes in perhaps and just screws you, whatever it is, just way too much rain, not enough rain, whatever the heck it is?
Yeah, so we've been on both sides of that. Some of the years we miss and miss by a fair amount because of the weather conditions largely late in the season, good or bad. And so we've been there, and it's hard to estimate crops in the third week of August, especially soybeans, because they're still largely in their development stage. Corn obviously is already pollinated, it's already filling, and it's further into its development. It just has to add weight at that point in time. But the soybeans, a lot of pods, and it depends on heat and moisture in how those pods fill out, and so it's difficult. As a result, we put a plus or minus 1% range on the corn and a plus or minus 2% range on the soybeans. But a couple of years ago, we hit both the corn and soybean estimates exactly. Probably has never happened before that both crops have been estimated by one firm to the exact numbers. We did that, and like I said, it probably never happen again. 2012, we hit the corn number exactly that year. Now our corn formula, the reason for that was it works better in very mature years. So when the crop is closer to harvest, well, 2012 was the drought year, and we were actually sampling in fields as some were being combined, and so we should have got close, and we actually hit it to the exact number. So there have been some times where we've had exact hits, and very rare, rare for anybody to be able to do that. And
Sure.
like I said, the one year we did hit corn and soybeans both, and astronomical odds of doing so, to be honest with you.
All right, so at the end of this, so you're getting all this stuff coming through each day. The week's done. You got all this entered in. What is that like then? There has to be this deluge of numbers you gotta put in and analyze and spit out because you got so many people waiting for the finished product. What's that like?
Yeah, so it's relief to be done with crop tour, in that sense. But then the hard work begins because that's when we start to analyze all that data and just really dive into it and get deeper into the analysis and the perspective on what we saw and what the numbers tell us, what the historical tell us, and all that stuff. And that Thursday night after crop tour is the late night putting together the Pro Farmer estimates. It's part of the process, but that one is probably the most difficult part of the week, to be honest. The Monday through Thursday is a lot of work during the day. We do a nightly meeting that involves literally hundreds of farmers at each location, and we release state data, crop tour data each night, and so there's all that in addition to interviews and things that we do, radio, TV interviews, newspapers, any kind of media basically. But that is what it is. The Thursday night when we have to sit down and crunch and say, okay, Not only are we taking into account all the crop tour data that we have, but everything else that goes into those pro farmer estimates. And that's really the culmination. But it's a long night. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of number crunching. It's a lot of back and forth between our team in terms of what we think the number ultimately will be. And at the end of the day, we put out the best number for corn and the best number for soybeans that we can come up with. And so yeah, I wouldn't put it out with our name on it if I didn't believe it 100% at that moment to be what we think the production and yields will be.
So are you like in a sports draft war room? You got all the top people together, or are you all spread out?
Yeah, no, that's a very good analogy. We're all in one room. And we don't necessarily have a draft board, but the draft board would be equivalent of all the data that we've collected,
Mhm.
spreadsheets that we have that we plug numbers into. So we have a weighted spreadsheet for both corn and soybeans, which starts with acreage, harvest, because your production is harvested acreage times your yield, and then that gives you your total production. So we go through every single state. We start with the states that the 7 crop tour states, and we do our numbers there. But then we adjust sometimes around that for because there's another 43 states that we aren't in that we have to take into account, and so we make some adjustments there. We make acreage adjustments if we feel necessary. And so that's a long and arduous process to get that to the final number. But we kind of know the numbers kind of lead you in a direction, and so you kind of know ballpark about where you need to be. And so that helps you kind of you back into it. So you know where you want to be from a yield and a production standpoint first, and then you make the other states fit into those numbers. If you did it the opposite way around and you just start plugging in what you think yield is for each state, you're going to be way off. That's usually my quickest way of telling whether somebody has actually done this process or not.
Mhm.
They'll say, "Oh, just plug in this state's going to do this and this." Yeah, you do that, and you're going to be off by a lot. I promise you. You have to back into it, and that's the same process that USDA uses. They know where they want to be from a yield and production standpoint on a national basis, and then you make the states fit it to get to that level, basically.
Is there anything as you're crunching these numbers, maybe when you're done, when they're crunched, when you're finished with it, anything surprise you this year that you weren't
Uh,
expecting?
well, my biggest surprise was that soybeans stole the show this year,
Hmm.
and typically not the case. Typically, the corn gets more attention because it's harder on soybeans, but the vast number of pods out there on soybeans, that was probably the surprise for me. So this will be the litmus test, so to speak, on does really heavily potted soybeans equal a massive yield? And it's going to depend on late season weather to some degree, because we know an optimal level on the pod counts on where yields are maximized. We figured that out over the years. We were above that this year, so there's a diminishing return above that level. That doesn't mean that the yield doesn't go up, because it does. You have more pods, so you're going to have more beans, but sometimes the bean size is smaller, and so you aren't getting as much bang for your buck, so to speak, above that optimal level. And we were above the optimal level this year, just a heavily potted soybean crop. Um, the other one is that we projected a record yield. And typically, to get a record, you have to have a lot of the states participate. And this year, the heavy hitters are through the Central Corn Belt. So Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska are going to carry a lot of weight this year.
Hmm.
Um, and we projected record yields for both corn and soybeans. And like I said, historically, you have to have those so-called fringe states, Southeast, Mid-South, Delta, Southwest, Plain states outside of the Corn Belt. really actively participate to get to a record. And that isn't the case this year. Some of those areas are hurting. And so, but the heavy hitters are coming up, to use a baseball terminology. The heavy hitters are coming up with the bases loaded or multiple men in scoring position. And that's what we're seeing this year with the corn and soybean crops.
And kind of carrying that lineup.
Yes, absolutely. And they have to. And they have to deliver. That's the thing. Not only coming up to bat, but have to deliver and knock in some runs when it comes to harvest time.
Okay, I can't help but think of this listening to you talk about all this. For all of us who struggled in math class in high school and in college, and then listen to a dude like you talk, you actually seem, despite the work that goes into this seems like it's actually fun. And watching you, for those of you who are watching the video, not just listening to the audio, I saw you smile. I don't know how many times since we've been talking. Like, you talked about how hard Thursday night is. You're in the war room. You guys are all going at it. But this seems like it's actually fun for you. Why is that?
Well, a couple things. It's my favorite week of the year, and it's my least favorite week of the year. It's my favorite because I get to go out and be in fields. I get to interact with our crop scouts. I get to be in front of literally thousands of farmers by the end of the week at these different locations. And so I absolutely love that. Love that aspect of it. The hate part comes in that, it, I guess it's not easy no means is it easy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of me changing hats each day multiple times throughout the day. It's late nights and early mornings and a lack of sleep. And fortunately, I don't require a whole lot of sleep, good or bad, but it's just how I am. Um, yeah, so there's a lot that goes into it. But it's very rewarding. And even if we miss on the crop estimates, and at the end, I'm like, we should have done this or should have done that, or there was a sign here that we missed, or, something there that we, discounted or didn't add in, or whatever the case may be. It just, the crops just didn't perform the way we thought they would. Even at the end of that, it's still rewarding. And, we're doing a service for farmers, the ag community. Everybody wants to know what the crop size is in the third week of August, and we're out there with boots on the ground, ground truthing what we find, and very transparent through the process. We don't hold back on any of the numbers. We make them available on a nightly basis, and it is what it is. It's a process, and that uh, the vast majority of farmers understand that, and agribusiness understand that. There is a faction of people that think we do a disservice to the industry, and that's unfortunate.
Our conversations each week are always really about farmland, and at the end of the day, it's about the love of farmland. So I'd like to end with this for you. You talked about growing up, you're thinking, I'm not going to have anything to do with ag, and here you are. What is it about, you mentioned this week getting out there, you get out there in multiple states, you get in front of so many people. The farmland itself, everybody's got some connection one way or the other if you're in this industry. What is it? What is that connection to you?
It's my roots. Growing up on a farm, it's the Midwest ties to agriculture and being such a large portion of what we do here in the central United States. It's work ethic, it's helping out when help is needed, and that type of thing. I think that's the biggest thing. The other thing I'll say is it's a little bit off from what you asked, but just to see the difference between what they deal with in Ohio versus what they deal with further west.
Mm.
Everything is really tight out east. The fields are tighter. They're much smaller. As you head west, everything kind of opens up, and then you get into Illinois and Iowa, and it's even more so out in Nebraska on the western leg. But it's just amazing, and you see the history of how the country was developed. Everything in the United States was developed from east to west, and so you're heavier and tighter on your eastern side of every single state almost. And as you get to the west, it opens up more, and then from state to state, as you go to the west, it opens up more. And so it's just really incredible to see that and the different farming practices. There's a vast difference between what they do in Ohio and what they do in Nebraska, even though the end goal's still the same, to produce as many bushels as you can of both corn and soybeans every single year.
We appreciate the conversation. Thank you much.
You betcha. Glad to be with you.
He is Brian Grete, editor of Pro Farmer. For more details about the Pro Farmer Midwest Crop Tour, just head to our website, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Brian is one of our featured stories in our weekly free email newsletter. You can check it out, and you can sign up and get that newsletter emailed right to you every week. Again, just go to AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about the future of our farm.